In 387 before Christ, a man who had nearly been sold into slavery on the island of Aegina walked through a sacred grove of olive trees northwest of Athens, and there, beside ancient altars dedicated to the hero Academus, he founded an institution that would endure for over 900 years. His name was Plato. He was roughly 40 years old, and the school he built that day would become the seedbed of Western civilization itself. But how does a boy born into aristocratic privilege during a catastrophic war, a young man shattered by watching his teacher drink poison in a prison cell, a philosopher nearly killed by a Sicilian tyrant, how does such a man create something that outlasts empires? This is the complete life of Plato. Not fragments, not famous quotations stripped of context. The entire journey, from first breath to final word. You will witness the Athens of his birth, a city crowned by the newly finished Parthenon, yet ravaged by plague and war. You will meet his family, descendants of kings and lawgivers, men who would become tyrants, and men who would become characters in his own dialogues. You will follow the young aristocrat as he abandons poetry and political ambition to trail a barefoot stonemason's son through the marketplace, learning to question everything he once assumed. You will stand in the courtroom where 501 jurors condemned Socrates to death, and you will understand what that morning cost the man who would spend the rest of his life writing that voice back into existence. You will travel with him to Megara, to the Pythagorean communities of southern Italy, where mathematics became a doorway to eternal truth, and to Syracuse, where philosophy met raw, tyrannical power and nearly perished. You will watch him return to Athens and build something unprecedented, a community of thinkers pursuing geometry, dialectic, and the question of justice itself beneath the dappled shade of olive branches. You will meet his students, among them a 17-year-old from Stagira named Aristotle, who would study at the academy for 20 years before challenging everything his master taught. And you will follow Plato back to Sicily, twice more, an aging philosopher still stubborn enough to believe he could transform a tyrant into a king guided by wisdom. He failed. He was imprisoned, humiliated, rescued only by the intervention of friends. Yet even failure revealed the man behind the dialogues, someone who refused to let philosophy remain merely words on papyrus. What makes this life irreplaceable is not merely the ideas, the theory of forms, the allegory of the cave, the vision of philosopher kings. It is that these ideas emerged from a specific human struggle. A man who watched democracy execute the wisest person he knew. A man whose own relatives led a murderous oligarchy. A man who sought, across 80 years of living and thinking, to answer one question. Is there any form of government, any arrangement of the human soul that does not end in catastrophe? 24 centuries after his death, we still read his words. We still argue with them. Every university on earth descends in spirit from that grove beside the Dipylon Gate. Alfred North Whitehead said all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Whether that is true, you will judge for yourself. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the lives that shaped how we think, subscribe so you do not miss what follows. Each week, we bring back to life one extraordinary figure, the real human being behind the immortal name. Now let us begin. The story opens not with philosophy, but with war, with plague, with a child born into a city that was simultaneously the most brilliant and the most dangerous place on earth. The year is approximately 428 before the Common Era. Athens is dying and being born at once. The Great Plague has already swept through the city twice, carrying off perhaps a quarter of the population. Bodies stacked in temples, funeral pyres burning through the night, the stench of death settling into the narrow streets between the long walls that connect the city to its port at Piraeus. Pericles himself, the man who built the Parthenon and made Athens the school of Greece, has been dead for a year, consumed by the same pestilence that devoured the poor and the nameless. The Peloponnesian War grinds on, Spartan armies ravaging the Attic countryside each summer, while Athens clings to its naval empire and the silver flowing from Laurion's mines. Into this world, magnificent, plague-scarred, ungovernable, a child is born to one of the city's most ancient families. His father Ariston traces his blood to Codrus, the last legendary king of Athens. His mother Perictione descends from Dropides, kinsman of Solon, the lawgiver who first gave Athens its constitutional order. The boy will be named Aristocles, after his grandfather. The name Plato, Broadide, will come later, perhaps from a wrestling trainer noting the width of his chest and forehead, perhaps from the breadth of his literary style. The sources disagree, and the nickname has outlasted the birth name so completely that the original feels like the invention. The household stands in one of the prosperous dems near the city centre. Painted pottery lines the andron where Ariston entertains guests. Linen curtains filter the attic light into the women's quarters, where Perictione oversees the weaving and the children, two older brothers, Glaucon and Ademantus, and later a sister, Potone. The walls carry traces of geometric borders in red and black. An altar to Apollo stands in the courtyard, smoke rising from morning offerings of barley and oil. Ariston dies while the boy is still young. Perictione remarries. Her new husband is Pyrilompes, a man of considerable political standing, a diplomat who once served as envoy to the Persian court under Pericles himself. His house is larger, his connections deeper. He keeps peacocks in his garden, birds brought back from eastern embassies, their iridescent feathers catching the sun as they strut between fig trees. The child grows up hearing political conversation at every meal, the war's progress, the assembly's decisions, the rising demagogues who fill the void Pericles left behind. Through Perictione's family, the boy is connected to men who will soon reshape Athens through violence. Her cousin Critias, brilliant, aristocratic, dangerous, writes elegies and tragedies and harbors contempt for democracy. Her brother Charmides moves in the same circles, handsome and politically ambitious. These are the men who gather in the andron, who debate Sparta's virtues and Athens' corruption, who will one day seize power and drench it in blood. The child absorbs everything. Meanwhile, above the city, the Parthenon gleams in fresh paint, its metopes still vivid in blue and red and gold, Athena's chryselephantine statue visible through the eastern doors when the angle of light permits. The Erechtheion is still under construction, its caryatids newly carved. The Odeon of Pericles hosts musical competitions. The theatre of Dionysus stages Euripides and Aristophanes. Athens remains, despite everything, the intellectual centre of the Greek world, a city where philosophy, drama, sculpture, and political experiment proceed simultaneously with war, plague, and factional hatred. The boy who will become Plato takes his first breath in this paradox. Beauty and death share the same streets. The greatest buildings ever raised by human hands overlook mass graves. The democracy that commissioned the Parthenon will soon tear itself apart. And somewhere in the agora, a stonemason's son named Socrates is already asking questions that no one in Athens can answer. The boy is perhaps 12 years old when his formal education begins in earnest. In an aristocratic Athenian household of this era, education is not a choice, but an obligation of blood. The sons of noble families are shaped according to ancient custom, the body through gymnastics, the soul through music, the mind through letters. Plato's family, with its connections to Solon and to the corridors of power, would have demanded nothing less than excellence in all three. The palaestra is where mornings begin. A rectangular courtyard open to the sky, its floor of packed earth raked smooth each dawn. Here, under the eye of a Paedo tribes, the young Aristocles learns wrestling, running, the javelin. Later sources suggest his wrestling instructor gave him the nickname Platon, the broad one, for the width of his chest and shoulders, though some ancient authorities attribute it to the breadth of his forehead, or even his literary style. Whatever the origin, the name adheres. The discipline of the wrestling ground, balance, leverage, the reading of an opponent's intention will echo decades later in his philosophical method, where arguments grapple and one position pins another to the ground. Afternoons belong to the Kytharistes and the grammatists. He learns the lyre, the modes of Greek music that Athenians believed could shape character itself, the Dorian mode for courage, the Phrygian for passion. He memorizes Homer, reciting the Iliad's catalogues and the Odyssey's wanderings until the hexameters live in his bones. He studies the tragedians. Diogenes Laertius reports that the young Plato composed dithyrambs, lyric poems, and tragedies, that he aspired to be a poet before philosophy claimed him. One tradition holds that he burned his verses after encountering Socrates. Whether literally true or not, the story captures something real. The dialogues he will eventually write are poetry transformed, dramatic art pressed into the service of truth. The intellectual atmosphere of Athens in these years crackles with competing voices. The sophists, Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, Prodicus, offer education for hire, teaching rhetoric and the art of making the weaker argument appear stronger. Their fees are enormous. Their influence on ambitious young aristocrats is profound. Plato certainly encountered their teachings, and his later dialogues dissect their claims with intimate familiarity. He also studied with Cratylus, a follower of Heraclitus, who taught that all things flow, that permanence is illusion. This exposure to radical flux will become the philosophical problem Plato spends his life answering, seeking what is eternal behind what merely changes. But the city around this education is hemorrhaging. In the summer of 415, Athens launches the Sicilian expedition, a vast armada of 134 triremes and thousands of hoplites sailing west to conquer Syracuse. Plato is approximately 13. He would have seen the fleet depart from Piraeus at dawn, the harbour thick with incense and libations, the silver prows catching first light. The whole city descends to watch. It is the most magnificent military force Athens has ever assembled. 2 years later, it is annihilated. The news arrives in fragments, total destruction, the army dead or enslaved in the stone quarries of Syracuse, the generals executed. Athens loses perhaps 40,000 men and 200 ships. The city staggers. Allies revolt. Sparta establishes a permanent garrison at Datelia, visible from the Athenian walls. The silver mines at Laurium are lost. Slaves flee by the thousands. The adolescent Plato watches his city begin to consume itself. Oligarchic conspirators overthrow the democracy briefly in 411. It is restored, then threatened again. The war grinds on. In the gymnasiums and at symposia, young aristocrats debate whether democracy itself is the disease, whether the mob that voted for Sicily deserves to govern. These are the conversations that will haunt the Republic. The education of the body and the lyre continues, but the world it was designed to serve is cracking open beneath the wrestler's feet. He is perhaps 20 years old when he first hears the voice. The sources disagree on the exact moment. Diogenes Laertius places their meeting when Plato was about 20, which would set it around 408 before the Common Era. The war is in its 23rd year. Athens has survived the Sicilian catastrophe, survived the oligarchic coup of 411, clawed back toward something resembling hope. And in the Agora, among the colonnades of the Stoa of Zeus and the workshops of the marble workers, a man of about 60, with a broad, flat nose and protruding eyes, is doing what he has done for decades, asking questions. Socrates is not what the young aristocrat expects. He is the son of a stonemason and a midwife. He goes barefoot in winter. He wears the same threadbare cloak year-round. He has no school, no fee, no written texts. He simply appears, at the gymnasium, at the fountain house, at the bankers' tables, and begins to talk. But the talking is unlike anything in the sophists' repertoire. Where Protagoras and Gorgias deliver polished speeches for silver, Socrates asks, "What is courage? What is justice? What is piety?" And when the confident general or the prosperous tanner offers his definition, Socrates dismantles it with a gentleness that is more devastating than any attack. The method is deceptively simple. A question, an answer. A further question that reveals a contradiction in the answer, another attempt, another contradiction. The interlocutor discovers that he does not know what he thought he knew. This is the elenchus, the cross-examination. And for a young man raised among politicians who speak with absolute certainty, it is a revelation. Plato abandons his tragedies. According to later tradition, he burns his poems. The political career that his birth demanded recedes. Something more urgent has seized him. What Socrates offers is not a doctrine, but a discipline. The unexamined life, he insists, is not worth living. Knowledge is not information accumulated, but ignorance recognized. Virtue is knowledge. If a person truly understands the good, they cannot choose otherwise. These propositions are radical enough to unsettle every assumption of Athenian public life, where rhetoric and persuasion matter more than truth. The young aristocrat joins a circle that includes Xenophon the soldier, Antisthenes the future cynic, Aristippus who will pursue pleasure as philosophy, and Chaerephon who once asked the oracle at Delphi whether any man was wiser than Socrates. The oracle said no. Socrates interpreted this to mean only that he alone knew he knew nothing. Meanwhile, the war reaches its final agony. Athens wins a desperate naval victory at Arginusate in 406, then executes its own victorious generals for failing to rescue drowning sailors, a decision Socrates alone opposes when serving on the council. The following year, at Aegospotami on the Hellespont, the Spartan admiral Lysander catches the Athenian fleet beached and unmanned. He destroys it almost without battle, 170 ships taken, 3,000 or 4,000 prisoners executed. The news reaches Athens. The wailing begins at Piraeus and travels up the long walls in the darkness, house to house, until the whole city knows. There will be no more grain ships from the Black Sea. Lysander's fleet appears in the Saronic Gulf. The siege lasts through the winter of 405 into 404. Starvation hollows the city. In the spring, Athens accepts Sparta's terms. The long walls come down to the music of flute girls, and the Spartans call it the first day of Greek freedom. Plato is 24. He has watched his teacher stand alone against the fury of the assembly. He has watched his city destroy itself through the very democratic processes it celebrates. And now, in the rubble of the walls his grandfather's generation built, a new question forms, the question that will drive everything he writes. Not merely what is justice, but whether a city can be built upon it. The walls are barely rubble when the new masters arrive. Sparta installs a commission of 30 men to draft a new constitution for Athens, and among them stand two names that Plato knows as intimately as his own blood. Critias, his mother's cousin, brilliant, ruthless, a former companion of Socrates, turned radical oligarch. Charmides, his mother's brother, handsome, philosophical, now wielding political authority for the first time. The young man at 24 watches his own family ascend to absolute power over the broken city. At first there is a veneer of legitimacy. The 30 arrest known informers from the democratic regime, men widely despised. Few Athenians protest. Critias speaks of restoring ancestral virtue, of purging the corruption that democracy bred. The council chamber on the hill of the Pnyx falls silent, not with the roar of assembly debate, but with the quiet of men who understand that objection means death. Armed Spartan guards patrol the agora. 3,000 chosen citizens retain their rights. Everyone else becomes subject to summary execution without trial. The terror accelerates through the autumn and winter of 404. Property confiscations fund the regime. Wealthy metics, resident foreigners who built businesses over generations, are seized and killed for their assets. Critias compiles lists. The prison near the agora fills and empties and fills again. Later sources estimate 1,500 dead in 8 months, more than the Athenians lost in many battles of the Long War. The smell of fear settles over the city like wood smoke in winter air. It is during this reign that Socrates performs the act Plato will record in the Apology. The 30 order 5 citizens, including Socrates, to arrest Leon of Salamis, a democratic general marked for death and confiscation. The other 4 comply. Socrates simply walks home. He refuses. Not with a speech, not with a public gesture, but with the quiet stubbornness of a man who will not soil his hands regardless of consequence. Plato later writes that Socrates would likely have been executed for this defiance had the regime not fallen shortly after. And fall it does. Democratic exiles gather in Thebes and at the border fortress of Philae under Thrasybulus. In the winter rains, they march on Piraeus. The battle at Munichia Hill in May of 403 decides everything. Critias falls in the fighting, the philosopher turned tyrant bleeding out on the slopes above the harbour. Charmides dies beside him. Plato's uncle and cousin, the men who sat at family dinners, who discussed Socrates' teachings in lamplit rooms, lie among the oligarchic dead. The democracy returns under an amnesty, a remarkable act of political restraint, that forbids prosecution for crimes committed during the tyranny. Athens chooses to forget rather than avenge, but Plato cannot forget. He has now witnessed both poles of political failure. Democracy condemned Athenian generals after Arginusi, launched the suicidal Sicilian expedition, and will soon kill Socrates. Oligarchy placed his own relatives in power, and they became murderers within weeks. The seventh letter, if authentic, records his state of mind. He was drawn toward public life, then repelled by what he saw, drawn again when the 30 initially seemed to promise reform, then horrified as they proved worse than what they replaced. The young aristocrat who might have entered politics, who had every connection, every advantage of birth, instead draws back into the circle around Socrates. The old philosopher still walks the agora, still questions, still refuses to flee or be silent. But the restored democracy watches him with suspicion. He was associated with Critias. He was associated with Alcibiades. The men now governing Athens remember these connections. A reckoning is coming, though it will take 4 more years to arrive. Plato does not yet know that the worst moment still waits ahead, that the city will demand his teacher's life, and that this final act will seal his convictions that Athens, and perhaps all cities, are incapable of governing themselves without philosophy. The reckoning arrives in the spring of 399 before the Common Era. 3 Athenian citizens, Anytus, a wealthy tanner and democratic politician, Meletus, an obscure poet, and Lycon, an orator, file a formal indictment. The charges are 2. Socrates does not recognize the gods the city recognizes, introducing new divinities instead, and he corrupts the young. Under Athenian law, both are capital offenses. The trial takes place in a single day, as custom demands, before a jury of 501 citizens drawn by lot. The court convenes in the open air near the agora, the jurors seated on wooden benches, each holding a bronze ballot disc. Socrates is 70 years old. He has no written speech prepared by a professional logographer. He speaks for himself. What he says, or what Plato later reconstructs him as saying in the Apology, is not a defense in any conventional sense. He does not grovel. He does not weep or parade his children before the jury for sympathy, as defendants routinely do. Instead, he reaffirms everything that brought him here. The divine sign that has guided him since youth, the mission to examine his fellow citizens, the conviction that the unexamined life is not worth living. He tells the jury that if they acquit him on condition of silence, he will refuse. He compares himself to a gadfly stinging a sluggish horse into wakefulness. The horse is Athens. The jury votes guilty by a margin of perhaps 60 votes, a narrow result, suggesting genuine division. Athenian procedure then requires both sides to propose a penalty. The prosecution demands death. Socrates, in what reads as deliberate provocation, initially suggests he be rewarded with free meals at the public hearth, the honor given to Olympic victors. He eventually proposes a fine of 30 minae, guaranteed by friends including Plato. The jury, perhaps angered by his defiance, votes for death by a larger margin than the conviction itself. Between sentencing and execution, a sacred ship has sailed to Delos for the annual festival of Apollo. Athenian law forbids executions until its return. Socrates waits in prison for approximately 30 days. Friends visit daily. Crito offers escape. Bribes are arranged. A boat waits. Exile in Thessaly is prepared. Socrates refuses. To flee would contradict everything he has taught about obedience to just laws and the examined life. The ship returns. On the final day, as Plato's Phaedo recounts through the voice of an eyewitness, Socrates bathes so the women will not need to wash a corpse. He speaks with friends about the immortality of the soul, calm as a man discussing geometry. When the jailer brings the cup of ground hemlock mixed in water, Socrates drinks without trembling. He walks until his legs grow heavy, then lies down. The numbness rises from his feet through his legs toward his heart. His last recorded words ask Crito to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, as though death itself were the cure for the disease of mortal life. Plato is not present. He records his own absence with a single devastating line. Plato, I believe, was ill. Whether this illness is physical or a literary device, a way of signaling that the Phaedo is reconstruction rather than transcript, scholars have debated for centuries. What is beyond doubt is the wound. Every dialogue Plato will write for the next 50 years circles back to this man, this voice, this death. The execution does not merely grieve him. It crystallizes a philosophical conviction that will reshape human thought. That democratic Athens, the most intellectually free city in the world, killed the one man most devoted to truth. If the best city murders its best citizen, then something is fundamentally wrong with how cities are governed, how citizens think, how justice is understood. The hemlock cup becomes the founding trauma of Western philosophy. The moment that transforms a brilliant young aristocrat into a man who will spend his remaining decades building an alternative to the world that produced such an act. He leaves Athens within days of the execution. The sources agree on this much, that the city which killed Socrates becomes unbearable to the man who loved him most philosophically. Plato is approximately 29 years old. An aristocrat without political prospects, a would-be poet who has burned his tragedies, a student without a teacher. The road from Athens runs northwest through the olive groves toward Eleusis, then onward to the isthmus, and beyond it the small city of Megara, where another of Socrates' devoted followers has established a household open to philosophical refugees. Euclides of Megara receives him. This is no minor figure. Euclides has developed his own philosophical school combining Socratic ethics with the Eleatic logic of Parmenides, arguing that the good is one and that apparent multiplicity is illusion. The Megarian streets are quieter than Athens, the harbour modest, the intellectual circle intimate. Here Plato encounters rigorous logical argumentation, the dissection of paradoxes, the insistence that reason alone, not sensation, not opinion, not democratic consensus, can reach truth. The stay lasts months, perhaps longer. Diogenes Laertius reports that several of Socrates' companions gathered here, a small community of exiles bound by grief and the determination to continue what their teacher began. What follows is less certain. Later biographers, Cicero, Strabo, and others writing centuries after, report travels to Egypt, where Plato supposedly studied with priests at Heliopolis, absorbing ancient mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Some sources mention Cyrene in North Africa, where the mathematician Theodorus taught. The historical evidence for these journeys remains thin, resting on tradition rather than contemporary testimony. Yet the pattern they describe is plausible. A wealthy young Athenian of philosophical temperament, seeking wisdom wherever the Greek-speaking world and its neighbors might offer it. What is documented with far greater confidence is the journey to southern Italy, to the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, sometime in the 390s before the Common Era. Here Plato encounters the Pythagorean communities that will transform his thinking permanently. In Tarentum, the prosperous port city on Italy's heel, he meets Archytas, statesman, mathematician, and philosopher who has been elected general 7 times without defeat. Archytas represents something Plato has never seen, a man who unites political power with genuine philosophical and mathematical mastery. The Pythagorean world is unlike anything Athens produced. These are communities organized around the conviction that number is the fundamental reality underlying all things. In their gatherings, geometry is not merely practical measurement, but a pathway to eternal truths. The ratios governing musical harmony, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, demonstrate that mathematical relationships structure the sensible world. A stretched string divided precisely in half produces a note 1 octave higher. The universe itself, they believe, is built on such proportions. Plato absorbs this revelation. The dusty demonstration grounds where Pythagoreans trace figures in sand, the triangle whose angles always sum identically, the circle whose ratio of circumference to diameter never changes regardless of size. These become laboratories of eternity. Here is something that democratic votes cannot alter, that tyrants cannot corrupt, that hemlock cannot kill. Mathematical truths exist independent of any human mind perceiving them. They are discovered, not invented. This insight will become the seed of everything. The theory of forms, that behind every imperfect visible circle lies a perfect circle, accessible only to intellect, that behind every flawed human act of justice lies justice itself, grows from this Pythagorean soil fertilized by Socratic questioning. The philosopher who left Athens broken by the murder of his teacher begins to construct, in these wandering years, the architecture of an answer. If truth exists eternally beyond the reach of ignorance and malice, then philosophy is not merely conversation in the agora. It is the mind's ascent toward what is permanently real. He is perhaps 38 years old when he finally turns back toward Athens, carrying with him the mathematical conviction that will reshape Western thought for 2.5 millennia. But he does not sail directly home. The route from southern Italy passes Sicily, and Sicily in these years means one thing: Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the Western Mediterranean, ruled by a man who has made himself master of half the island through war, cunning, and relentless will. Dionysius I has held power for nearly 2 decades. His fortifications on Ortygia Island, the tyrant's personal citadel connected to the mainland by a causeway bristling with guards, represent the most ambitious military architecture in the Greek world. His shipyards produce warships of unprecedented size. His mercenary armies, drawn from Campania and Iberia, answer to him alone. He is poet, engineer, general, and despot, and he has heard that a philosopher from Athens is traveling nearby. The circumstances of Plato's arrival remain partially obscure. The 7th letter, if authentic, suggests Dion arranged the visit. Dion is approximately 20 years old, brother-in-law to the tyrant, wealthy, handsome, and possessed of an intellectual hunger that the Syracusan court cannot satisfy. He encounters Plato and is transformed. Later sources describe the young aristocrat abandoning the luxurious Sicilian lifestyle overnight, embracing the philosophical life with the convert's absolute fervor. In Dion, Plato sees what he has been seeking since Socrates died: a soul naturally inclined toward justice, positioned near the levers of supreme power. The philosopher king exists not yet as written doctrine, but the seed is here, in this friendship forged on Sicilian soil. The court itself is another matter entirely. Dionysius holds banquets of legendary excess, couches draped in Tyrian purple, tables groaning with Sicilian wine and roasted game, flatterers competing for the tyrant's approval. Into this atmosphere walks a man trained by Socrates to speak uncomfortable truths. The ancient accounts, preserved through Plutarch and Diogenes Laertius, describe a confrontation. Plato speaks of justice and virtue. Dionysius grows irritated. The philosopher reportedly declares that what benefits the tyrant is not necessarily what benefits the city. The aging despot, accustomed to sycophants, asks what business brings a philosopher to Sicily. The answer attributed to Plato, that he seeks a good man, enrages the tyrant. What follows is disputed in its details but consistent in its outcome. Dionysius arranges for Plato to be placed aboard a Spartan vessel. Some sources say he explicitly orders the philosopher killed or sold. The ship puts in at Aegina, an island then at war with Athens. Under Aeginetan law, any Athenian found on the island may be sold as a slave. Plato, approaching 40 years of age, a man of aristocratic Athenian blood who has studied with the wisest teacher in Greece and conversed with Pythagorean masters, stands in a slave market. The humiliation is total. Philosophy offers no protection against chains. The rescue comes through Anacharis of Cyrene, a philosopher or wealthy admirer, the sources vary, who recognizes Plato and pays the ransom of 20 or perhaps 30 minae. When friends later attempt to reimburse Anacharis, he refuses, declaring that they are not the only ones worthy of caring for Plato. The philosopher returns to Athens carrying the knowledge of what tyranny truly is, not as abstraction but as lived experience. He has seen power without wisdom, magnificence without justice, a city enslaved to one man's appetites. And he has seen in Dion the possibility that philosophy might yet reach the throne. Both lessons will haunt him for decades. He arrives home sometime around 387 before the Common Era, and he knows now exactly what he must build. Northwest of the Dipylon Gate, beyond the Potter's Quarter where kiln smoke drifts across the Kerameikos Road, the land rises gently toward a grove of ancient olive trees and plane trees watered by the Cephissus. This is the precinct sacred to the hero Academus, or Hecademus in the older form, a place of altars, running tracks, and dappled shade where Athenians have exercised and gathered for generations. Boundary stones mark the sacred ground. Timon beautified it decades earlier with planted walks and irrigated gardens. It is here, around 387 before the Common Era, that Plato acquires property, a small house and garden adjacent to the public gymnasium, and begins something unprecedented. He does not call it a school in any sense his contemporaries would recognize. The sophists rent rooms, charge fees, and offer courses with defined endpoints. Plato creates a community. The men who gather in the grove share meals, contribute to common expenses, and commit themselves not to a curriculum with a graduation, but to a life organized around the pursuit of knowledge. There is no fixed term of study. Some will remain for years, others for decades. The model owes something to the Pythagorean communities Plato encountered in Italy, their communal living, their reverence for mathematics, their belief that intellectual discipline transforms the soul. Mathematics stands at the center. Geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, harmonics. These are not mere preparation, but the very training that turns the mind from the visible world toward intelligible reality. The later tradition that an inscription above the entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," may be apocryphal. No source earlier than the 6th century of the Common Era records it, but it captures something true about the Academy's spirit. Before one can pursue dialectic, the highest philosophical method, one must learn to think in abstractions, to perceive relationships that no eye can see. The physical setting matters. Instruction happens outdoors, in the shade of sacred trees, along garden paths where walking and thinking become inseparable. The gymnasium provides space for the bodily discipline that Greek education never separates from intellectual cultivation. Communal meals, simple fare, wine mixed with water, create the bonds of sustained conversation. This is philosophy not as performance, but as daily practice, as a way of inhabiting time. The early students are drawn from across the Greek world. Some come from aristocratic Athenian families, others travel from allied cities. Women may have been present. Diogenes Laertius names Axiothea of Phlius and Lasthenia of Mantinea, though the evidence is late and debated. What draws them is not professional training, but the extraordinary intellectual atmosphere, a place where the deepest questions about justice, reality, knowledge, and the good life are pursued with mathematical rigor and literary grace by a man who has survived tyranny, traveled the Mediterranean, and nearly died for his convictions. Plato himself is now approximately 40 years old. The wrestler's frame has thickened. The political ambitions of his youth have been transmuted into something larger, not the governance of one city, but the formation of minds capable of governing any city wisely. He lectures, though the content of these unwritten teachings will become a matter of scholarly dispute for millennia. He writes, producing dialogues that circulate beyond the Academy's walls, and he presides over a community that will outlast every political institution of his era. The grove of Academus becomes a living organism. It grows slowly through the 380s, attracting mathematicians and political theorists, astronomers, and ethicists. Cities begin sending representatives to consult Plato on constitutional matters. The Academy is not yet the great institution it will become when Aristotle arrives. That lies 2 decades ahead. But its foundations are being laid in these quiet years, in the geometry traced in sand, in the arguments refined over evening wine, in the conviction that sustained intellectual community can reshape the human world more durably than any army or any throne. The dialogues begin to flow in the years between 380 and 370 before the Common Era, and they arrive not as treatises, but as living dramas. Plato composes on papyrus in the quiet hours, his reed pen moving with the deliberation of a man who has spent a decade teaching before committing his thought to writing. What emerges is unlike anything Greek literature has produced. Philosophical argument fused with theatrical art, ideas embodied in characters who breathe, argue, drink wine, and die. The symposium unfolds at a banquet in the house of the tragic poet Agathon, set dramatically decades earlier in 416, when Plato himself was a child. Guests recline on couches draped in linen, garlands of violet and myrtle circling their brows, and each offers a speech on the nature of love. The evening builds through wit and mythology until Socrates speaks, recounting what a priestess named Diotima once taught him, that love is not possession of beauty but an ascent toward it, climbing from a single beautiful body to beautiful souls, to beautiful knowledge, until the lover glimpses beauty itself, eternal and unchanging, beyond any mortal form. The scene is fiction built on memory, and Plato knows precisely what he is doing, making philosophy seductive. The Phaedo reconstructs the final hours in the prison cell, Socrates calm among weeping friends, arguing that the soul is immortal because it participates in the form of life and cannot admit its opposite. Here the theory of forms crystallizes. Behind every beautiful thing lies beauty itself. Behind every just act lies justice itself. The visible world is shadow. Reality is intelligible, grasped through reason alone. Then comes the Republic. 10 books, Plato's longest dialogue after the Laws, and the work that will define political philosophy for all subsequent ages. The dramatic setting is the house of the elderly Cephalus in Piraeus, the conversation stretching through a single night. The question appears simple: what is justice? But Socrates dismantles every conventional answer until he must construct an entire city in speech to locate justice within the human soul. The city requires 3 classes mirroring the soul's 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Guardians trained in mathematics and dialectic must rule, because only those who have seen the good itself can govern without corruption. The allegory of the cave emerges here. Prisoners chained since childhood, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking flickering projections for reality. One prisoner is freed, dragged upward into blinding sunlight, and after agony learns to see the sun itself, the form of the good, source of all truth and being. The philosopher must then descend again into darkness to govern those who cannot yet see. This is not abstract speculation. Plato writes from the wound of lived experience, the democracy that killed Socrates, the oligarchy that murdered innocents, the tyrant in Syracuse who preferred flattery to wisdom. The philosopher king is his answer to every failure he has witnessed. Whether such a ruler can exist outside the pages of a dialogue remains the question Plato himself will test again in Sicily. These middle dialogues share a luminous confidence. The Phaedrus sets Socrates outside the city walls for once, reclining beneath a plane tree by the Ilissus stream, discoursing on the soul as a charioteer driving 2 winged horses, one noble, one unruly, toward the rim of heaven, where the forms blaze in their eternal procession. The imagery is mythic, deliberately so. Plato understands that pure argument cannot carry every truth. Some realities require the language of vision. He composes these works while teaching daily in the grove, and the dialogues serve double purpose. They preserve Socratic method for readers beyond the academy's walls, and they advance arguments further than the historical Socrates likely ventured. The forms, the tripartite soul, the metaphysics of participation, these are Plato's own contributions, placed in his teacher's mouth with artistic license he never conceals from careful readers. The dramatic dates look backward, the philosophy looks forward, toward a systematic account of reality that will occupy him until death. By the early 370s, before the Common Era, the Academy has become something unprecedented in the Greek world, not a temporary gathering around a single charismatic teacher, but a living institution with its own rhythms, its own culture, its own gravitational pull on the brightest minds of a generation. The sacred grove of Academus hums with activity from dawn until the lamps are lit. Students walk the garden paths in pairs, testing arguments against one another. In the gymnasium, the same young men who spent the morning wrestling with geometric proofs wrestle each other on the sand, because Plato insists that philosophy requires a disciplined body as much as a disciplined mind. The daily pattern is deliberate. Mornings belong to mathematics, not as mere calculation, but as training for the mind's ascent toward abstract truth. Eudoxus of Cnidus, perhaps the most gifted mathematician of the age, works alongside Plato during these years, developing his theory of proportion that will later appear in Euclid's Elements. Eudoxus brings astronomical models too, concentric spheres rotating within spheres to account for the wandering paths of planets against the fixed stars. The Academy's garden becomes a place where geometry and cosmology intertwine, where a diagram scratched in sand with a stick opens onto the structure of the universe itself. Afternoons belong to dialectic. Plato lectures, though later sources suggest his public lectures sometimes baffle listeners expecting practical wisdom and receiving instead dense arguments about the nature of the good. The method remains Socratic in spirit. Question and counter-question, hypothesis tested to destruction. But the scope has expanded far beyond anything Socrates attempted in the Agora. Political theory, ethics, epistemology, the classification of natural kinds, the foundations of law, all fall within the Academy's reach. Greek cities begin sending envoys to consult Plato's circle when drafting new constitutions, a remarkable testament to the school's growing authority. Speusippus, Plato's nephew through his sister Potone, is already a fixture, sharp-minded if temperamentally different from his uncle. Xenocrates of Chalcedon, earnest and methodical, studies alongside him. Heraclides of Pontus brings literary flair and speculative boldness. The community shares meals together, and these communal suppers carry philosophical purpose. Conversation continues over wine mixed with water, ideas tested in the relaxed atmosphere that Plato dramatized so brilliantly in the Symposium. Then, in 367 before the Common Era, a 17-year-old arrives from Stagira, a small colonial town on the Chalcidic Peninsula far to the north. His name is Aristotle. His father Nicomachus served as personal physician to King Amyntas, the third of Macedon, but both parents are dead by the time the young man reaches Athens. His guardian sends him to the Academy, and Plato reportedly recognizes something extraordinary almost immediately. Later tradition preserves Plato calling Aristotle the mind of the school, the reader, a student who devours texts with an appetite the Grove has not seen before. Aristotle will remain for 20 years. The relationship between master and student becomes one of history's most consequential intellectual partnerships, and also one of its most complex. Aristotle absorbs the Platonic framework, the commitment to universal truth, the primacy of reason, the conviction that knowledge must be systematic, and then slowly begins to push against it. But that rupture lies far ahead. In these early years, the young Stagirite sits among the olive trees, listens, questions, and writes. Dust motes drift through slanting afternoon light. A stylus presses into soft wax. Somewhere nearby, Eudoxus traces the orbit of Venus with a compass on a wooden board. Plato is now past 60. His hair has whitened. His step through the grove is slower, but his authority is absolute, not through force or title, but through the sheer accumulated weight of thought. He has built something that will outlast him, and he knows it. The academy is no longer merely his school. It belongs to the questions themselves. Then the letter arrives from Syracuse. Dionysius the Elder is dead. The old tyrant who had humiliated Plato, who had reportedly sold him into slavery at Aegina, has died in the spring of 367 before the Common Era, succumbing, so the sources claim, to a fever following celebrations of a dramatic victory. Power passes to his son, Dionysius II, a young man of perhaps 30, who has been deliberately kept ignorant of statecraft by a father who trusted no one. And now Dion writes, Dion, the brother-in-law of the dead tyrant, the aristocrat who had listened to Plato with burning intensity on that first Sicilian visit nearly 20 years earlier, sends urgent word to Athens. The moment has come. The new ruler is malleable, curious, untested. If Plato will come now, if he will shape this young man's mind before the courtiers harden it, then Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the Western Mediterranean, might become what the Republic imagined. A city ruled by wisdom. Plato is past 60. The academy flourishes. Aristotle has just arrived. Every rational consideration argues against the voyage. Yet the seventh letter, whatever its disputed authorship, preserves the reasoning that tips the balance. He fears being merely a man of words, never of deeds. If he refuses, the dream of philosophy transforming power becomes empty rhetoric. He would be ashamed before himself. The ship carries him south and west across summer waters, past the familiar headlands of the Peloponnese, into the open sea toward Sicily. Syracuse rises from the harbor, its massive fortifications, the island citadel of Ortygia connected by a causeway, the quarries where Athenian prisoners had died half a century before. Royal triremes escort him in. The reception is extraordinary. Dionysius II greets the philosopher with elaborate ceremony. Court wagons are draped in fine textiles. The tyrant's own chariot conveys Plato to the palace. For a brief season, something remarkable unfolds within those limestone walls. The young ruler takes up geometry with apparent passion. Courtiers report that the palace floors grow white with chalk dust from diagrams. The word spreads through Syracuse that philosophy has seized the throne. Plutarch records that a kind of fever for learning sweeps through the court, that men walk about discussing the nature of justice and mathematical proportion. But the palace of a Sicilian tyrant is not the grove of Academus. Philistus, the old historian and loyalist who had served the father, watches this philosophical invasion with cold calculation. He understands what Dion intends, not merely education, but transformation, a fundamental shift of power toward those who think as Dion thinks. Philistus whispers to the young tyrant that Dion's true ambition is the throne itself, that philosophy is merely the instrument of a coup disguised in geometric proofs. The poison works. Within months of Plato's arrival, Dionysius turns against his uncle. Dion is accused of secret correspondence with Carthaginian enemies. A letter is produced, perhaps genuine, perhaps fabricated. The exile is swift and brutal. Dion is placed aboard a small boat and sent away from Sicily, his vast estates initially preserved, but his person banished from the island he had expected to help govern through wisdom. Plato remains, but the geometry lessons grow hollow. The young tyrant still professes devotion to philosophy, still invites the Athenian to dinner, still asks questions about the nature of the good. Yet the questions carry an edge now, a testing quality. Dionysius wants to be thought wise without submitting to the discipline that wisdom demands. He wants the reputation of a philosopher king without the philosopher's surrender of appetite to reason. The palace corridors grow watchful. Plato's movements are observed. His conversations are reported. He is housed in comfort, but the comfort has the texture of confinement. Mercenary soldiers loyal to the tyrant patrol the grounds of Ortygia. The harbor is controlled. Departure requires permission that is not forthcoming. When Plato finally secures passage home, sometime around 365 before the Common Era, he sails from Syracuse carrying the knowledge that the dream has cracked against reality. The philosopher king remains an idea inscribed on papyrus, beautiful in the afternoon light of the academy, impossible in the limestone corridors where actual power resides. Dion wanders in exile through mainland Greece, his anger sharpening into something that will eventually become violence. And in Syracuse, the chalk dust is swept from the palace floors. 4 years pass. The chalk dust settles in Syracuse and accumulates in Athens, where Plato resumes his lectures among the olive trees, where Aristotle sharpens his questions, where the geometric diagrams multiply in the sand. But the letters keep arriving from Sicily. Dionysius II writes with a persistence that borders on obsession, flattering, cajoling, promising that this time he is ready. This time philosophy will find its throne. He surrounds himself with other philosophers, lesser minds who tell him what he wishes to hear, and he writes to Plato that the education was merely interrupted, never abandoned. He wants the master back. Plato is 67 years old. His joints ache in the morning cold. The voyage to Sicily is no small thing. Days on open water in a merchant vessel, the autumn winds unreliable, pirates a constant threat in the strait between Italy and the island. Yet something pulls at him. Dion, still in exile on the Greek mainland, urges the journey. Archytas of Tarentum, the Pythagorean mathematician and statesman whom Plato deeply respects, adds his voice. The 7th letter, if it is genuinely Plato's, records the reasoning with painful honesty. He feared that refusing would prove he was merely a man of words, that his philosophy amounted to nothing beyond beautiful arguments. He feared being a coward before his own ideals. In 361 before the Common Era, an aging philosopher boards a ship bound for Syracuse for the 3rd and final time. The harbor of Piraeus falls behind. The Saronic Gulf opens into deeper blue. One imagines him standing at the rail, the salt wind in his white beard, knowing already what he refuses to admit, that this voyage is born not of hope, but of obligation to a principle that reality has already refused. He arrives to find Syracuse transformed by tension. Dionysius has quarreled with Dion's remaining supporters. Mercenary captains jostle for influence. The young tyrant's enthusiasm for philosophy proves, once again, theatrical rather than genuine. He wants Plato's presence as ornament, as legitimacy, not as teacher. The geometry lessons resume, but dissolve into banquets. The dialectical conversations are steered away from justice and toward flattery. Then the trap closes. War erupts among Sicilian factions. Dionysius confiscates Dion's property, the estates whose income had been guaranteed as a condition of Plato's return. When Plato protests, the tyrant's warmth evaporates. The philosopher finds himself moved from the guest quarters inside Ortygia's fortified island to lodgings among the mercenary garrison. The soldiers eye him with indifference. He is not a prisoner in name, but no ship will carry him without the tyrant's seal. Weeks become months. The Mediterranean autumn deepens into winter, closing the sailing season entirely. Plato is stranded in a city that has become his cage, surrounded by armed men who answer to a ruler he can neither persuade nor escape. The seventh letter describes this period with a restraint that barely conceals fury and fear. He is an old man, far from home, at the mercy of a young man's vanity. Salvation comes not from philosophy, but from political calculation. Archytas of Tarentum, whose city maintains diplomatic relations with Syracuse, sends an embassy, officially on state business, privately to extract Plato. A 30-oared galley arrives bearing Tarentine envoys, who request, with the careful courtesy that masks an ultimatum, that the philosopher be permitted to sail with them. Dionysius, unwilling to offend a powerful neighbor, relents. Plato departs Syracuse for the last time in 360 before the Common Era. The limestone fortifications recede across the harbor water. He will never return. The philosopher king remains what it always was, an argument on papyrus, luminous and unreachable, belonging to the realm of forms rather than to the brutal mechanics of actual governance. The dream has not merely failed, it has demonstrated with the clarity of lived experience the distance between wisdom and power. He sails north toward Tarentum, then east toward home, carrying nothing from Sicily but confirmation that the world does not yield to reason alone. He returns to Athens in the autumn of 360 before the Common Era, 70 years old, and the grove of Academus receives him as it always has, the plane trees casting their dappled shadows across the paths, the boundary stones standing where they stood when he first consecrated this ground. But something has shifted. The man who walks these colonnades now carries Syracuse in his bones, not as ambition but as knowledge, the specific, irreversible knowledge of what philosophy cannot do when set against appetite and force. And from this knowledge, paradoxically, comes the most extraordinary period of sustained composition in his life. The late dialogues emerge in a voice transformed. Gone is the dramatic sparkle of the symposium, the passionate myth-making of the Phaedrus. In their place arrives something harder, more technical, almost austere, the voice of a thinker revising his own foundations. The sophist and the statesman, likely composed in these years, introduce a stranger from Elea as their philosophical guide, and Socrates recedes to the margins, listening rather than leading. The method itself changes. Division and classification replace the open-ended questioning of earlier works. Plato is no longer dramatizing the search for truth, he is constructing systems. The Timaeus represents perhaps his most ambitious reach, a cosmology that begins where the Republic ended and attempts nothing less than an account of how the visible universe came into being. A divine craftsman, the demiurge, gazes upon eternal forms and shapes the cosmos as a living creature endowed with soul and intelligence. The mathematics of the Pythagoreans, absorbed decades earlier in southern Italy, here becomes the very structure of physical reality. Triangles composing the elements, geometric proportion governing the distances between celestial spheres. Scribes copy these passages onto fresh papyrus, while astronomical models of concentric rings sit nearby, casting shadows in the afternoon light that falls through the academy's open porticos. The Critias follows, telling of ancient Athens and the island civilization of Atlantis, and then stops, mid-sentence, unfinished. Whether interrupted by death, dissatisfaction, or the pull of other work? No source tells us. The fragment remains, suspended in time like a broken column. But it is the laws that consumes his final years, 12 books, his longest work, dictated to scribes rather than written in his own hand if later tradition is credited. Here Socrates vanishes entirely. An unnamed Athenian stranger walks with a Cretan and a Spartan along a road to the cave of Zeus on Crete, and together they design a city not ideal but possible, a second-best constitution for human beings as they actually are, governed not by philosopher kings, but by detailed legislation touching every aspect of life, from education to drinking parties to burial rites. The work breathes the air of Syracuse, of hard lessons absorbed. It is Plato at his most practical, his most exhausted, his most honest about the distance between the form of justice and the clay of human nature. Within the academy itself, whispers circulate of unwritten doctrines, teachings Plato delivers orally but refuses to commit to papyrus, concerning the one and the indefinite dyad as ultimate principles underlying even the forms themselves. Aristotle attends these lectures and takes notes that survive only in fragments quoted by later commentators. The relationship between the written dialogues and these oral teachings will puzzle scholars for 2 millennia. The library grows. Scrolls accumulate in their wooden cases. Students arrive from across the Greek world, from Heraclea, from Byzantium, from the cities of Asia Minor. Plato lectures on the good, and those who come expecting practical wisdom find instead an exposition of mathematics. The Academy's reputation has never been greater, yet its founder grows quieter, more inward, dictating through long afternoons while the olive trees outside shed their silver leaves into autumn wind. The last years unfold quietly. Plato is past 80, his body diminished, but his mind still turning through the final revisions of the laws, that immense work he will never fully complete. Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later, records that he died around 348 before the Common Era, attending a wedding feast, the celebration of a student's marriage, according to some accounts. The detail has the texture of something remembered rather than invented. The old philosopher reclining among younger men, the wine and garlands, the music of flutes drifting through a warm Attic evening. He withdraws from the gathering. He sleeps. He does not wake. Other traditions place his death more simply, in bed, at the Academy, a papyrus scroll still near his hand. Cicero would later note that Plato died writing. The sources cannot be reconciled with certainty, but they converge on the essential fact. He departed without violence, without exile, without the hemlock that had taken his teacher. Athens did not kill this philosopher. Time did, gently. His burial takes place near the Academy itself, in the grove where he had taught for 4 decades. The tomb becomes a site of reverence. Students lay offerings there for generations. His nephew Speusippus, son of his sister Potone, assumes leadership of the school, a choice that suggests Plato valued family continuity, or perhaps that the community chose the man closest to the founder's inner circle. Speusippus will lead for 8 years before Xenocrates succeeds him, and the chain of scholacs stretches forward, unbroken, into centuries Plato could never have imagined. The Academy endures. It changes. Under Arcesilaus, in the mid-3rd century before the Common Era, it turns skeptical, arguing that certainty is impossible, that Socratic doubt was Plato's deepest teaching. The school that had sought eternal forms now insists that knowledge of them cannot be achieved. This academic skepticism dominates for nearly 2 centuries, shaping Roman intellectuals including Cicero himself, who studies at the Academy in the 1st century before the Common Era and carries its methods into Latin prose. Then the current shifts again. Middle Platonism emerges in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, recovering the metaphysical ambition of the original dialogues. Plutarch reads Plato as a theologian of the divine mind. The forms return, now interpreted as thoughts in the mind of a supreme god. The dialogues circulate through the Roman world on papyrus rolls, copied and recopied, debated in Alexandria, in Rome, in the provincial cities of the empire. The final transformation is the most radical. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, Plotinus, an Egyptian Greek who studied in Alexandria, reimagines Plato's philosophy as a vast metaphysical system. The one emanates mind, mind emanates soul, soul generates the material world. Plotinus insists he is merely reading Plato correctly, but he creates something new, Neoplatonism, a philosophy that functions as a spiritual discipline, a path of ascent from matter to the divine source. His student Porphyry edits his writings into the Enneads. Iamblichus adds ritual and theurgy. Proclus, in 5th century Athens, systematizes everything into crystalline logical structures, lecturing in the very city where Plato had walked, though the Academy building itself has been destroyed and rebuilt more than once. The physical grove has suffered. Sulla's army stripped its trees for siege works in 86 before the Common Era. The site was rebuilt, abandoned, rebuilt again. But the intellectual lineage persists, a living chain of teachers and students spanning nearly 9 centuries from Plato's founding to the final act. That act comes in 529 of the Common Era. The Emperor Justinian, consolidating Christian orthodoxy across the Roman Empire, issues an edict prohibiting pagans from teaching philosophy. The last scholar, Damasius, and 6 colleagues depart Athens for the court of the Persian king Khosrow, seeking refuge for a tradition the Christian empire no longer tolerates. The academy closes, the olive grove falls silent. 900 years. No other institution of learning in the ancient world endured so long. The scrolls survive, carried east to Baghdad, preserved in Byzantine libraries, waiting in monastery collections for the centuries when they will be needed again. The body of the philosopher lies somewhere beneath Athenian soil, its exact location lost. But the words remain, every dialogue intact, copied with extraordinary fidelity across the centuries by hands that understood they were preserving something irreplaceable. The words travel east before they travel forward. In Baghdad, during the 9th century, the House of Wisdom hums with translators rendering Greek into Arabic. Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his circle work through Plato's dialogues, the Republic, the Timaeus, the Laws, preserving ideas that much of Latin Christendom has temporarily forgotten. Al-Farabi, writing in the 10th century, composes treatises on Plato's political philosophy, imagining the virtuous city governed by a philosopher-ruler whose wisdom mirrors divine intellect. Avicenna absorbs Platonic metaphysics into his own vast synthesis, and through these Arab intermediaries, the forms find new vessels, new languages, new centuries in which to persist. But the dialogues never entirely vanish from the West. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, encounters Plato through Neoplatonic translations and recognizes something he can use: the notion of an eternal, immaterial reality beyond the senses folds almost seamlessly into Christian theology. The forms become thoughts in the mind of God. The ascent from the cave becomes the soul's journey toward divine illumination. Through Augustine, Plato enters the bloodstream of medieval Christianity, shaping how cathedrals are conceived, how universities organize knowledge, how theologians understand the relationship between the visible world and its invisible source. In Constantinople, Byzantine scholars copy the dialogues with meticulous care onto parchment codices. The oldest surviving complete manuscript of Plato's works, preserved now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, dates to the late 9th century. A single volume containing every dialogue, carried across 1,000 years by the patient labor of scribes who understood that these texts were foundational. Then Florence, 1484. Marsilio Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, publishes the first complete Latin translation of Plato's dialogues. The effect is seismic. Renaissance humanism already stirs with recovered classical learning, but Ficino's translation makes the full range of Platonic thought available to Western readers for the first time in over a millennium. The Academy is reborn in spirit at Ficino's villa in Careggi, where scholars gather to read the Symposium by candlelight, crowning a bust of Plato with flowers. The philosopher-king ideal shapes political imagination from Thomas More's Utopia to the constitutional debates of the 18th century. The centuries accumulate their debts. Galileo's conviction that nature speaks in the language of mathematics echoes the inscription tradition attributed to the Academy's gate. Romantic poets find in the Symposium a philosophy of love that transcends the physical. Whitehead writes in 1929 that the safest characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, an exaggeration that contains an irreducible truth. In 1931, archaeologists working northwest of central Athens uncover the remains of a large building near the sacred grove. Boundary stones confirm the site. The Academy, or what time has left of it, emerges from beneath olive roots and modern roads. The foundations are modest. No grand colonnades survive. Just stone footings in dry earth, marking where the longest conversation in Western history began. The dialogues remain. Every one of them. 36 works attributed to Plato survive complete, a preservation rate almost unmatched in ancient literature. They are read today in translation across every inhabited continent, assigned in universities that trace their institutional ancestry, however distantly, to a grove outside the Dipylon Gate, where a broad-shouldered aristocrat who had watched his teacher die decided that the examined life required a permanent home. The hemlock cup is empty. The Academy's stones lie quiet under Athenian soil. But the questions endure. What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good? What do we truly know? Asked first in a voice that has never stopped speaking. Thank you for joining this journey through the life and legacy of Plato. If these stories brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so you never miss the next exploration into the lives that shaped our civilization.